All right, we're back with our continued conversation,
Yes.
continued analysis of the Mexican-American War.
And yeah, in the previous couple of episodes, we mostly went over battles, especially the last one was a lot of like kind of TikTok of the battles. On this one, we're going to get into some issues and some personalities, some of the big political issues of the day, I guess, and not quite the exact day, but some of the things that are kind of percolating or have been percolating in America at this time, some of the things that our politicians and generals, who are also pretty much politicians, are concerned about.
Yeah, a little more background here too, right?
Yeah.
With the
Yeah.
So right, we were talking Zach Taylor's Northern campaign, and right, this is going to be a little higher level,
Yes,
but also different leaders involved with the conflict too, right?
Yeah, we're just going to talk about some issues, and hopefully we can kind of circle back to some of the things that are going on here. So I guess one thing we're going to talk about first is the nullification crisis. Jason, if you could bring that up. I have a few notes here. This, you may be familiar. South Carolina basically declared that an act of Congress signed by the president was null and void, and that it could not be enforced in South Carolina. Had to do with tariffs that were, tariffs were a big issue.
Just like federally imposed
tariffs, and this was viewed as hurting South Carolina. South Carolina was hurting economically at this time. The North and the South had very different economic interests at this time. You had, a slave economy as opposed to a not slave economy, and these things are different, and this issue had been building for a long time. I should step back and talk about kind of the overall issue of nullification, and basically, do the states have the right to not abide by or veto an act of the federal government?
This is kind of going all the way back to the
founding fathers, and it's thought that Jefferson and Madison had opinions about this. It was argued that they passed resolutions to these effects in the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures, I believe, stating that nullification is an option. James Madison was still alive at this in 1832, I believe. He was, or maybe a little before that. He was very old, but he was alive and offered an opinion that, no, I wasn't saying you can nullify, but definitely the sort of Jeffersonian democracy kind of concept did involve a very weak federal government, right? And state power.
Well, I mean, if you go back to what the rule of the king versus the rule of the people, and just always being kind of, it's just part of the American tradition, right? Is to be somewhat anti-centralized government, right?
Anti-centralized government, and
autonomy for local or autonomy for the people, basically, right?
Yes,
let us self-rule, let us self-govern.
Yeah, basically free from the king and free from each other. As we said, these states have very different interests, and South Carolina and Massachusetts had different views on things, as they do today. This was really the case at this time, and one countervailing thing that happened was the War of 1812, where which you know a lot about, where the infrastructure of America was just inadequate when we were fighting Britain. They were able to walk in, pretty easily to the capital and a lot of places, right? And
naval dominance for sure.
Yeah, naval dominance, and I mean, we obviously had some wins there, but it's overall not a good look, and not a government that could do much in the face of a threat. And since then, there are a lot of thinkers that maybe we need a strong federal government, and this view, you had your beginnings of parties. You had your Federalists and your Democratic Republicans, and I think there are people in both of those factions that favored a strong federal government.
Right.
Certainly, Andrew Jackson was more on the states' rights, pro-slavery side, definitely, but turns out he was also for a strong federal government, which was at issue here. So,
yeah, I mean, on the military front, like I remember stumbling upon this Nullification Crisis of 1832 because I guess Winfield Scott was involved with not really suppressing it per se, but I think like there was like at least troops that were identified to deal with it.
Yeah, a little bit. There were basically eventually Congress authorized troops to enforce if necessary, but there was also an effort to compromise as there were in the big issues of the day from maybe the 1820s to 1850s. There were efforts to compromise and basically keep the big, underlying all the stuff of slavery. Abraham Lincoln's comment about a house divided, and eventually, the country was going to break up over it, and we were going to have to fight. It seems inevitable, but there were, heroic efforts to compromise on things. And
it's interesting where, slavery as the driving issue.
Yes,
but then certainly that state versus federal.
Yeah.
Who does ultimately have the authority? In a lot of ways, where it's like, South Carolina in this case, which I think it's interesting too, that it was in South Carolina, just because obviously South Carolina leads the charge later with, seceding from the Union. But I mean, it's here already in 1832, clearly, a state saying, no, like federal government does not get to ultimately determine our fate here.
And this had been percolating for a long time, and it was one of the big ideas out in the States. And as early as 1822, South Carolina passed a nullification law on this tariff, which was declared unconstitutional. And basically, it continued to be a more and more prominent issue. Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828, again with the support of the South. He was basically the, states' rights candidate, right? And John Calhoun of South Carolina was his vice president.
Okay.
Which it gets really interesting here, though, because this crisis just deepening. South Carolina keeps passing laws that they can, ignore this tariff, and the probably leading progenitor of this thought is Vice President John Calhoun, and which is just really interesting because at the same time President Jackson is strongly opposed to this, and this is why he is given, one of the reasons he's given good marks by historians through much of the 19th and 20th centuries. He sort of kept the Union together, right, at this time, when it could have already came apart at this time. Jackson's reputation was later kind of besmirched by slavery and what he did to the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, which obviously becomes prominent more with modern historical views.
Right.
But at the time, he was viewed as as an effective president for holding this off, which John Calhoun actually leaves the vice presidency for the 1832 election and is elected by the legislature in South Carolina as a senator from South Carolina to articulate this view. And he was, the most articulate, basically person putting this view forth regarding nullification. So it was a real crisis, and as you said, there were Congress authorized troops, but at the same time, figures like Henry Clay, the senator and House member from Kentucky, who was very prominent in politics at this time, put together a compromise to reduce the tariff so as to not hurt South Carolina as badly. So we basically got out of this without a shot fired, but
for the time being,
but these things weren't resolved, and some of these, well, a lot of these figures remain prominent throughout the Mexican War era into the Civil War.
Yeah, so like Winfield Scott, so he fought some in the War of 1812 already.
Yes.
So yeah, it's some of these characters is kind of interesting, right? So Andrew Jackson is kind of a big pillar of the first half of the 19th century in American history, right? And then I think I incorrectly said that I thought like Taylor fought under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. I think I was looking back at Taylor's activities during the conflict, and I saw he actually fought over by Davenport. There's like what's it called? Credit Island conflict or something over there, where it's more fighting with Native Americans that are backed by the British.
Yes, there were pretty significant conflicts with the Native Americans. In the Quad Cities area, there are several islands. Credit Island is still there. Rock Island, where there continues to be a prominent Department of Defense presence today. The original thing they had there was a Confederate prison, and eventually cemetery, because many of the prisoners didn't make it, of course. But yeah, that's still there, and you can visit it.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I saw that. I saw Taylor was kind of out in the West then. He was there, Indiana to some extent. And then Winfield Scott was more up north, more like Canada, lower Canada conflict. So anyway, that was about how much I learned about Winfield Scott, was just that he was in those northern Canadian front battles. And then, he was involved with different Native American conflicts, but then this Nullification Crisis too.
Yeah, and do you want to go up a little bit? I'm gonna get my notes up. A few things here. Yeah. And again, Scott County, Iowa, named after him, as are several counties in America, but Scott County is probably the most populous one. Winfield Scott is from Virginia, as were many of the prominent figures of this era, as well as the previous generation of founding fathers. This is kind of the generation after that. Born in Virginia in 1786. His father was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was a large man, 6'5" and 230, and I believe he got larger than that as he got older, as do many of us. He was from a somewhat prominent family and practiced law for a bit, as many prominent figures did at that time. I believe all you had to do was read law, they called it, basically work at a office of a lawyer, and then you could be a lawyer.
It's more of an apprenticeship kind of thing.
Kind of. I mean, it was.
There's no bar exam.
No, it's not like it is today, which maybe was better than later.
Maybe.
Yeah, but
fought a duel.
Yeah, he basically got inspired to join the army around the War of 1812, and he was not impressed by the experience. Again, he thought it was unprofessional and slovenly, and he did get into fights, and he did get into a duel in which I believe neither party hit, because he was with us, and
right, he made it out.
Was subject to a court martial, but survived that. And he fought in Canada. He was taken prisoner of war, and basically distinguished himself in that war. Was promoted to general as a young man. Got national recognition for what was viewed as the first successful campaign against the British.
He's in his 20s then.
Yes.
Okay.
and then he just continued to be in the military in peacetime. And he was able to implement his views of a more professional military. West Point was started while he was in the military. And the generation of leaders that, basically were generals during the Civil War, were cadets under his leadership. He was basically, in one way or another, in charge of the military for a long time, although the chain of command is not always clear during this time. At one point, he was named a commanding general, which it's not clear what he was actually in charge of, just that he was, a big deal, basically.
Right. They kind of had a different concept back then, didn't they? Of
Yeah.
You're just kind of like the commander of the army, the commanding general of the entire army, which obviously that has not survived into the modern era.
No. And President Polk, who was kind of a Jacksonian, as I think we've discussed, basically was a political rival of Scott, who was mentioned at various times as a possible presidential candidate. Eventually was, not yet in our timeline here. Polk actually spent a lot of time trying to cause another prominent politician, Thomas Benton, a senator from Missouri, tried to basically put him in charge of the military and, basically box out General Scott, who was a prominent figure and had a lot of support in the country. And Polk was not successful at this. Congress wouldn't accept it. And kind of circling back to the Nullification Crisis, General Scott was involved in basically having the troops there and ready to go in case that, we had to put down a rebellion from South Carolina, which it didn't come to that, but he was involved in the planning of that. General Scott was also involved in much of the so-called Indian removal, forcing Native Americans out of their native lands, which was, of course, a project under President Jackson that was continued by the next president, Van Buren.
Right.
Was a prominent thing that was going on then, and a lot of what the military was involved in between the various wars. And
seems like the story of the 19th century. Really,
it pretty much continues throughout the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's the Civil War. There's this war. There's the Spanish-American War, but when those aren't being pursued, it's like there's some kind of Native American conflict.
Some action, whether it's in what's now the Quad Cities area or in Minnesota or the Dakotas or Montana.
Yeah.
Just a lot of these actions going on, and General Scott was involved in them. And, we kind of just bring him up as a figure, just kind of to explain a little about who he was, just because he'll be very prominent pretty soon as the person who plans the invasion starting in Veracruz, right?
Right in in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes, basically amphibious invasion. Getting troops here via the Navy, and yes, starting what became some of the decisive battles of this war. And we just wanted to get into some biography here because I like biography.
Well, and he's going to be a big figure out of this conflict. Yes. And then I think we probably could just touch on even after this conflict. Yeah. He's kind of a pretty big character in history.
He continues to be a big figure in history. He was the Whig presidential nominee in 1852, didn't do well, lost to President Pierce. But yeah, he was an important enough figure to be, thought that
a presidential nominee.
In these days, generals often were, nominated for that. Zach Taylor was the president,
right?
Who was the general we've been talking about, and died in office. And then you had Fillmore, who was not popular, and then you had the the Pierce presidency and then the Buchanan presidency, basically, as students of history know, basically the weak presidents who tried to keep the Civil War from happening by basically appeasing the South. And didn't work. And so then President Lincoln gets elected, which basically sets off the Civil War. And General Scott is still there. He's in his 70s, and he is involved in the initial planning of the Civil War. Some of the battles that didn't go well, and was at this point he retired. He was well past what you would think of a normal retirement age for a military, but
so that's a big career.
Yeah, it's a big career. You're going from the War of 1812.
He fought the British in 1812,
and then you're still there in 1861, involved in the planning of, and he was involved in like keeping Lincoln safe for the inauguration, because there were a lot of obviously death threats, and it was that maybe we could preserve the South's position by assassinating Lincoln, which happened eventually, but not before we won the Civil War. So it's just very interesting to me. This figure was around for this long, and
it's a figure that nobody, I don't think, really talks about. Nobody really knows about this guy.
I mean, people have a lot of views about General Lee or General Grant or a lot of the Civil War great generals who were in this war that we're talking about, but they're not as prominent. They're kind of fighting under other generals. And
I think like this talk right here is kind of what I was hoping to get out of our doing this, is just to talk about like kind of these. I mean, to me, this is like lost to history. Like Americans don't know this guy, and this is an influential figure here for sure.
Yeah. And these things like this nullification issue, I mean, it's coming up. We're having a conflict in 2024 about immigration law, and can Texas implement basically go against what the federal government wants to do, and who's prominent there, which side is right. The Supreme Court is deciding these issues now, and it's really one fun thing about studying history is that there's actually nothing new under the sun, and
for sure, right.
All these things have come up before, and kind of how they were resolved might be interesting, might provide some guidance into things that are going on now, which we're not going to get into our opinions on things going on now, but
it's interesting context for
it's just interesting context. And like, what should the states be able to do against, as opposed to the federal government, when the president and the leaders of various states have vastly different views on things.
Yeah. I was just looking back at any other kind of notes in terms of political leadership here. I know that I just had a couple of notes that like the Secretary of State at the time was James Buchanan. For Polk.
Yes.
And then was it William Marcy is the Secretary of War?
The Secretary of War. And yes, there were a lot of conflicts. I mean, that's another reason to bring up General Scott, is there were basically constantly conflicts between him and Polk Secretary of War, Secretary Marcy, kind of, and their differing views on things pretty much shaped this conflict, and Taylor too, but I think maybe Scott was a slightly more prominent figure. So, the conflicts between them, kind of shaped how the war went, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's certain times where it's kind of like president directly to Taylor sometimes, right? It's like White House to Taylor, or it could be White House to the Secretary of War, the what now is the Secretary of Defense effectively. But then sometimes it's no, go to the commanding general of the army, right?
Which
and then it'll flow through army channels to Taylor. So you got these different chains of command or different communications paths, at least.
Which I don't know if we were discussing this, publicly like we are now, or just amongst ourselves, that right now in the federal statutes, there's a clear chain of command through the Secretary of Defense.
Right.
And, if the U.S. is to be involved in the military conflict, there's clear chains that goes through,
right,
in terms of all the way down to the soldier who's going to, I don't know, carry out a drone strike or actually do a ground invasion somewhere.
Right. Overall, we've kind of made it even, more and more clearly civilian led over time, where it's like, yes, the president is considered the commander in chief. It's not that there's the commander of the army. Like, I'm not coordinating with the commander of the army to have the commander of the army handle everything. It's like, no, the president's the commander in chief. The Joint Chiefs of Staff now, they're purely advisory. They're basically giving advice as the senior service members of each of their respective branches, and that's it. It's not like the Joint Chiefs of Staff are in charge of those branches of the military. You've got, from the Secretary of Defense, you have civilian secretaries of each service branch. So you've got the Secretary of the Army, the Secretary of the Navy. So it's just been increasingly clarified as civilian led.
Yes.
And that even goes into reforms coming out of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So that definitely was a slow transition kind of from the earliest days of the country to modern era.
Yeah, and the interesting dynamic that, again, Scott and Taylor, in addition to being the most prominent generals, are also political figures and most likely rivals to, Polk, which Polk only served one term, I believe. He said he would only serve one term and did, but, obviously he was the leader of a political faction. And,
but is Taylor a Whig too? I'm trying to remember.
And the conflicts between the various political factions are also prominent here, which is why we want to discuss some of the issues. And the issue more than anything that I think was the most important of the first, 80 years of American history was slavery. And one interesting thing is that John Calhoun was against the Mexican War, which is rare for the maybe pro-slave faction. But in terms of what you might call a white supremacist faction, I guess, he didn't want Mexicans in the country and was worried that a provision limiting slavery in the new territories would pass, which it almost did. So his fears weren't far off. But
so he thought you're going to expand into the West, and then it's going to be northern aligned.
Yeah,
basically, that you're going to have band,
or basically, people that are not the white race, maybe, in the way that he conceptualizes
the WASPs and whatnot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or might have more of a role in the country than he wanted. That was his fear. So that's, again, just to kind of go show that these things are complicated, and there's kind of discussions on all sides of issues, and both the pro and anti-slave, pro the North and South. There were all different views on this war.
Right. Yeah, that's always interesting to think about too, the fact that you did have at least some people that were opposed to the conflict, right? I mean, it seems like it was broadly popular, and obviously when you win, things tend to be more popular, but
when there was losses, it was less popular, and there were people opposed to it. We discussed Abraham Lincoln, who ran for Congress successfully in opposition to this war. So in Illinois, so there were, again, a lot of different views and always a lot of politics going on in the conduct of the war.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, anything else on this one, or?
I don't think so. I think, we just a little context for the battles we'll probably discuss next time. Hopefully we were able to pull that together in a way that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think so. Well, again, if you're listening to this and you're enjoying it, certainly feel free to leave us a comment on our YouTube channel. That's probably one of the best ways to comment. Let others know that you enjoy it.
Thank you, everybody.